First of all, I thank the director of this famous Institute of Calcutta for inviting me to deliver this lecture. I also thank my former colleague, an outstanding scholar on political science and philosophy, Dr. Datta Gupta, who has taken so much trouble for conducting many resource persons and also the participants of this seminar. I must also thank the librarian and the information officer of this institute, Mr. Parthapratim Chattopadhyay, for his untiring efforts in organizing this seminar. My thanks are due to the members of the august audience here. A good number of the members of this audience are my former pupils at Calcutta University, and some distinguished personalities having general interest in Hegel are also attending the today's lecture. I thank you all. I don't know whether I shall be able to satisfy your expectation. I have studied Hegel for many years. I have delivered lectures. I have taught my students many aspects of Hegel philosophy for over 28 years in Calcutta. But even today, I feel sometimes nervous when I am asked to deliver a lecture on Hegel within the limitation of, say, 1 hour or 1 hour and 30 minutes. It's a challenging task, no doubt. But how I was compelled to take up this study of Hegel and to teach my students, that is a very long story. It was in fact thrust upon me by the then head of the Department of Philosophy, Professor P.T. Bhushan Chattopadhyay, upon me. He told me, if you cannot take up this challenge, where shall I go? How can you find a student who can take up this challenge if you do not take it yourself? That's how I was forced to study Hegel. But when I started, there were not so many books, not only in Calcutta. There were not so many books, readable books, which can communicate the ideas of Hegel properly to us anywhere in the world. We got to know Hegel via British philosophy, especially the philosophy of British idealism. And it is some scholars in the universities of Britain who came forward to translate some of the books of Hegel. And it is through them that I came to know of Hegel. But there were few commentaries, few books explaining the position of Hegel according to the text. The British philosophers explained Hegel in terms of their own philosophical position, which I have called British idealism. But then, how to present a picture of Hegel accurately on the basis of his own understanding, on the basis of his own understanding and as expressed in his own writings. I have given you a writer, perhaps you have gone through it. In that writer, I have just mentioned about the earliest translation made of Hegel's one book, The Science of Logic, by Hutchison Starling. Since then, it required a few years for others to come out with other translations. And we got those translations from, say, 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, 80s, etc. The latest translation I have mentioned in that writer is the one by T.M. Knox and A.P. Wheeler. And in that translation, that is the translation of all the introductions to the lectures on the history of philosophy. And that served a very important purpose for our understanding of Hegel. Now, this is one side of the story. As Professor Sobhanlal Datta Gupta was telling you, that you can ask questions even in Bengali. I have to teach Hegel in Bengali also. You know, there is one comment by T.M. Knox. The comment was made in the year 1984, that empiric English is not adequate to express the philosophic German. If English is not adequate for expressing philosophic German, then you can imagine how it is difficult for a Bengali to understand Hegel's philosophy via English translations. That is also a problem with us. However, in spite of all these problems, in the greater domain of Bengali culture, a culture which is associated with the development of the institutions of higher learning in the early 20th century. The postgraduate department of Calcutta University started in the year 1912. It is thereafter that some people came out to study Hegel seriously. But they were circumscribed, their aspiration was circumscribed by the translations that they got. Only 2 or 3 translations were available at the time. But then, from the third decade, or at the end of the second decade of the 20th century, the message of Marxism came down to so many enlightened Bengalis. And the Marxist party was formed in the third decade of this century, in the 20th century. From then on, through the Marxist literature, there was a kind of penetration of Hegelian thought into the broad spectrum of our intellectual culture, which you cannot deny. But here also, we have understood Hegel as the founder of what is called the dialectical method, a method which is supposed to be followed by Karl Marx. Although we know that this is a very superficial view. Hegel's dialectical method is essentially speculative. I shall explain to you what is meant by the term speculative by Hegel. Now, that speculative model has been taken over by Marx to explain the laws of development of society. Now, whether he has done the right thing or not, that it is not the point to be discussed here today. But I think some missing link is there. It is very difficult for us to make a comparison between Hegelian dialectic and Marxian dialectic, especially in this class. However, there is some close link between the two. There is another problem. Just after the death of Hegel in 1831, the intellectuals of Berlin who were studying in the University of Berlin made it as it were a battleground among two groups of followers of Hegel. One group came to be known as the right-wing Hegelians, the other group came to be known as left-wing Hegelians. Now, Marx, somehow or other, was influenced by the left-wing Hegelians like Bauer and Feuerbach. So, his influence has come down from a source, not directly from Hegel, but via the left-wing Hegelians. However, a sound scholar like Marx tried to understand some of the writings of Hegel. It is my feeling that Marx did not study Hegel's logic very seriously. He studied only his phenomenology, some aspect of phenomenology, of spirit, and some aspect of, say, the philosophy of right. So his views, he wrote a critique on the philosophy of right also. So that is the only direct exposure of Marx to the literature of Hegel. This is one thing. But then, as we have come to know Hegel via the translation of his works by the British Hegelians, and these British Hegelians were an idealist of a different type. Their influence also was very of consequence to our understanding of Hegel. Now you see, Hegel exercised his influence not only upon Marxism, but also upon so many philosophical and political movements. His influence on Husserl, Heidegger, Sark's phenomenology, and the phenomenological existentialists of a later date. Then it is also said that because of his espousal of the cause of nationalism, Hegel has been regarded as the source of Hitler's National Socialism also. And then many of the European democratic movement claim that there was something to Hegel. So Hegel is the source of so many philosophical ideas, so many political ideas, so many cultural trends that affected the lives of the people throughout the world. Then came the mighty tide of Marxism that shook the edifice of many, of so many states in different continents from early to mid 20th century, and we cannot deny that all these things have their influence upon our understanding of Hegel. Even when we recognize Hegel's overarching influence, we cannot deny the distinction that Hegel made an important distinction between system and method. While understanding his philosophy, we shall have to understand the distinction between his system and method. The early Marxists, including Engels, time and again, emphasized it, that this distinction has to do something with the difference between the right wing and the left wing Hegelians. In his small book, Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy, Engels pointed it out that the right-wing Hegelians were in favor of the Hegelian system, while the left-wing Hegelians were in favor of the method of Hegel. Now, the controversy centering around system and method in Hegel cannot be understood without entering into some of his own utterances, some of his own writings. So I shall always refer to his own writings to analyze some of the important Hegelian ideas and conceptions. Now you see, my considered opinion is that a clear picture of this controversy can emerge from Hegel's own conception of philosophy. As we advance in this direction, we shall see that in Hegel's own conception, there is scope for both philosophy as a system and philosophy as a method of dialectic. We should not think that in Hegel the distinction was there. It was made subsequently by the Marxists. Hegel says clearly about philosophy as a system. We cannot understand his philosophy without understanding it as a system. We begin with one clear statement by Hegel, which is given in his introduction to the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences. This statement is, unless it is a system, a philosophy is not a scientific production. Unsystematic philosophizing can only be expected to give expression to personal peculiarities of mind and has no principle for the regulation of its contents. Unless we believe in a system, unless we believe in philosophy as a system, we can have no idea of the principle that can regulate the contents of philosophical discussion. Now, the above remark gives us one side of the picture, but Hegel gives us another picture when he deals with mind or spirit as the innermost self of man. Mind may be perceptive or sentient, and then its object is something sensuous. I'm drawing your attention to Hegel's conception of mind or spirit. The German equivalent of the English word mind or spirit is Geist. Some translators uses it as mind, some as spirit. So we shall have to take this liberty. Mind may be perceptive or sentient, and then its object is something sensuous. Mind may be imaginative, and then its object is an image. It may also have the form of will, and then it will have an end as its object. Whenever we will something, we set up a goal, we pursue a goal, and so the goal is outside of us. But Hegel claims none of this is a true form of mind. Then what is the true form of mind? It has only thought as its object. Thought is the inner self of mind. As mind reflects on its own self, a continuous movement of thoughts take place. About thought intrinsic to mind or spirit, Hegel remarks, while thus occupied, that is, while the mind is occupied with thought, what happens? Thought entangles itself in contradictions, loses itself in the hard and fast non-identity of thoughts, and so instead of reaching itself, is caught and held in its counterpart. Then he says, to see that thought in its very nature is dialectical, and that as understanding it must fall into contradiction, the negative of itself, will form one of the main lessons of logic. So what do you find? In logic, it tries to show that philosophy must be a work of system building, and at the same time, that work of system building must follow the dialectical method. We cannot follow one without the other. Now, now we need to attend to the nature of thought as understood by Hegel, and then to its relation to philosophy. So I have explained to you one point, that the innermost characterization of mind should be that its essence consists in thought and thought alone. We cannot have a mind which does not devote itself to thinking. The closeness of thought and philosophy was clearly stated by Hegel as he defines philosophy as pure thought thinking itself. We should be very clear about it. This is Hegel's definition of philosophy. Philosophy is pure thought thinking itself. This definition can be found in very many works of Hegel, not only in his logic, not only in his science of logic or lesser logic, not only in his lectures on philosophy of history, but also his lectures on history of philosophy, but also in his philosophy of right. Philosophizing by any individual, he believes, is not a very easy task. One cannot be a philosopher without devoting his whole life to the globe, to attending the movement of thought itself. Profession of philosophy is not for the layman, for one dealing with a specific subject alone. That is, a scientist cannot be a philosopher, or a social scientist cannot be a philosopher, one who deals with only one subject. For people who seek pleasure in spending time in idle gossip. So one cannot do philosophy like entering into a dialogue, a Socratic dialogue as it were. Philosophy is a much involves a harder task. Hegel's ponderings on this subject will be clearer as we deal with his conception of philosophy in detail. For Hegel, philosophy is an intro-reflective activity. We may recall his famous remark at the end of the preface to the Philosophy of Right. That is a very famous remark quoted by many people in different contexts. What did he say there? He says, when philosophy paints its grey in grey, then has the shape of life grown old. By philosophy's grey in grey, it cannot be rejuvenated, but only understood. Now see, this is a very pessimistic view, that philosophy begins when man is fed up with the material world, with all the things around him, his environment, etc. Why? Why does he say so? There is a point in his saying that for this we shall have to understand Hegel's view about the beginning of philosophy. You just see that philosophy paints this grey in grey, then the shape of life has already grown old. That is, it is an old man's job, as it were, who lives a life of reflection alone. But that is not all. Hegel sets the origin of philosophy against the background of an overall decadence of morals, loss of freedom, and emergence of all-round corruption in a country, in a race. In his lectures on history of philosophy, he has pointed out the origin of Greek philosophy establishes this point, that after the Peloponnesian War, the Ionian philosophy arose. Then again, after the war between Sparta and Athens, and after the internal political turmoil within Athens itself, that the philosophers turn to that some people turn to philosophizing. What does it say? Philosophy begins with the downfall of the real world. The mind or spirit then shows its indifference to worldly comforts and takes its flight into the regions of thought. Philosophy takes the form of a luxury, as it were. But such luxury, although it consists of enjoyments and occupations which are not in any way related to the material needs of life, this luxury is undoubtedly valuable for human beings. Why? Philosophy, of all the intellectual pursuits, is a free activity. It is not an activity for self-seeking. It is free because the anxiety of desire is gone. The anxiety of desire, when the anxiety of desire is there no more, it is only then one can truly philosophize. Then he says, it is strengthening, uplifting, and fortifying of the spirit in itself. If we attend to each of these words, it is strengthening, uplifting, and fortifying of the spirit in itself. So these are the words in terms of which we can understand this famous remark of Hegel. But as we are socially conscious people, we shall have to set it in contrast to one famous comment by Karl Marx. What is that comment? Who made it after 24 years, of the publication of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, where he made this comment. His remark, this is a part of the famous thesis on Feuerbach, where he says that philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point, however, is how to change it. So, Hegel did not have the choice of changing the world. Marx did have the choice. He has his choice settled at that time that he must work in such a way, he must philosophize in such a way that he can change the world. Perhaps he was much more concerned about the sufferings of man, but Hegel distances himself from the suffering of man. In fact, he distanced himself from any activity that relates to the satisfaction of self for personal benefit. It is no self-seeking activity. For him, philosophy is no self-seeking activity. Now, this is how we try to understand Hegel's concern of pure philosophy. We have not yet understood the entire significance of his view about pure philosophy. We must remember that Hegel never claimed that he was working in a vacuum. He had his predecessors. He has many things to learn from his illustrious predecessors in philosophy, especially Aristotle. Hegel's conception of philosophy as the thinking of pure thought has its source in Aristotle. While discussing the nature of Sophia or wisdom, Aristotle describes Sophia as self-thinking thought. In Greek it is called noesis, self-thinking thought. He argues that wisdom does not aim at anything outside itself, and is therefore it remains self-contented. This is self-knowledge, and in no way the thought of this or that object. Now, this Sophia, or he identifies with God, which he describes as pure and perfect. God remains outside the world, but as being pure and perfect, he attracts the world of the material world towards him. Everything in this world are moving towards God because they try to get some amount of purity and perfection enjoyed by God alone. So God attracts them without moving himself. Aristotle describes his God as the unmoved mover of all moving objects. The comparison between Hegel's pure philosophy or pure thought, which he often refers to as simply as the idea spelled with capital I, and Aristotle's conception of Sophia as unmoved mover, needs elaborate and comprehensive discussion, to which we cannot enter at this point. Hegel's conception of pure philosophy involves elaborate and comprehensive analysis of the object it deals with. Not that Hegel has provided such an analysis in one place. I should mention one thing to you. We can separate all of Hegel's writings into two parts. Some of it are written by him and published by him during his lifetime. Some of these are based on his lecture notes, taken by his former pupils. And these were published, almost all of these were published posthumously. So his lectures on aesthetics, his lectures on the philosophy of history, his lectures on history of philosophy, his lectures on philosophy, history, aesthetics, etc. Yes. All these lectures were posthumously published based on the notes taken up by their students. Now, while I refer to his writings, I shall mention especially his own writings, especially the smaller logic, which is a part of his great work, Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences. Some of it can be found in the smaller logic, but a significant portion of it can be found in his additions to the philosophy of right. But you see, some of this can be found also to the introductions of his lectures on the history of philosophy. I am using the expression introductions because from 1818, when he, from 1816, when he joined the University of Heidelberg, till his death in 1831, when he was a professor in the University of Berlin, he went on delivering so many lectures. And while delivering separate lectures on, especially on history of philosophy, he gave introductory lectures. These were referred to as introduction. To all the lectures, these introductions were published, as I have said, by were translated by A.P. Miller and T.M. Knox. In his introduction to the lectures on the history of philosophy, Hegel refers frequently to the object of philosophy. What is that object? The object of philosophy is God, the absolute, the spirit, reason, or the absolute idea. Hegel claims that one truth, one idea, one reason runs through all different systems of philosophy. It is the same reason, same self-developing thought that develops from one stage of thinking to another. When the highest stage is reached, the thoughts or thought forms of the earlier stages are not absolutely negated, but are retained. We have already seen how Hegel understands the role of a living spirit as the architect of the grand temple of the spirit itself. Hegel believes that the same architect is working everywhere. What is that architect? That architect is what Hegel calls the God, the idea, the spirit, etc. That is the object of philosophy. And that object runs through all the systems of systems of philosophy. One must know how. That is the object of philosophy. To Hegel, pure philosophy and pure thinking bear the same meaning. Pure thought is unmixed thought. Thought that does not involve or relate to anything other than itself. I have referred to his conception of pure thought, but I am now trying to clarify it. What does he mean by pure thought? Pure thought is thought not related to anything outside itself. Pure thought relates only to itself, so it is self-relational. Like perception, imagination, memory, and willing, it is not related to anything outside itself. Perception is related to the perceived object. I am reiterating the same thing as I have told earlier, that the essence of mind is thought. That is the most important conclusion of Hegel. The essence of mind is thought, and if that is, the essence of mind is not perception, it is not memory, it is not imagination, it is not willing, etc. So, because in every other thing, the object lies outside itself. Only in thought, the object is related to thought itself. That's why he says thought is self-relational. So Hegel says time and again that pure thought is different from image, imagery, or analogy. To the empiricist, idea is a mere image of the object perceived. Imagery and analogical argument depend on images received by way of perception. But to Hegel, pure thought can in no way relate to anything outside itself. If mind relates itself to anything outside itself, it will be as contingent and variable as spatio-temporal objects are. Hegel intends that philosophy must unwaveringly adhere to the path traversed by thought and must not be detracted by any prevailing opinions. Here is a point. Hegel is driving home one particular point, that philosophical thought must not be allowed to pass as a form of personal opinion. He criticizes people, even his students, who allows philosophical thoughts to pass as their personal opinion. For example, someone says, "My opinion is that." Hegel rebukes such students. Don't say so. In philosophy, there is no place for personal opinions. If someone is a student of philosophy, he must give out his personal opinion. Why? He holds that an opinion is always subjective. It is mine or yours. So he says that philosophy contains no opinions. There are no philosophical opinions. Philosophy is an objective science of truth, a science of the necessity of conceptual knowing. It is no opining and no wave spinning of opinions. So there is no place for opinions in philosophy. Then what philosophy will be doing? It will be just a work of thought. It will be just a work of reason. It will be just a work of God as he understands it. He understands it as spirit, as reason, a reason which thinks itself. The task of thought consists in unwaveringly to adhere to traverse the path laid down by it, and not to be detracted by any prevailing opinions. I have told you that. So you see that to follow the track of thought, if you follow the track of thought, you will be on the path of building a philosophical system. Otherwise, you cannot build up a philosophical system. That is this thing. From the nature of pure thought, it follows that it cannot be anything else than the form of thought. What is pure thought? Pure thought moves with certain things. What is that? It has a form. It moves along with its form. In other words, the content and form of thought move together. Content and form of thought move together. If, as a form of thought, philosophy cannot, as a form of thought, everything must be universal. He is coming upon the idea of a concrete universal. In Hegel's philosophy, I shall explain to you the idea of concrete universal. In his philosophy, thought moves with, or rather, thought moves with, only with, its concrete forms, which are concrete universals, and this is described by Stirling as the secret of Hegel, or Hegel's philosophy. Stirling named his book The Secret of Hegel. The secret of Hegel is that the vehicle of thought, the form of thought with which thought moves, cannot but be a concrete universal, meaning thereby thought always moves in a form, concrete of form and content. Let us try to explain. Philosophy, as a science of thought forms, it is the science of the universals. Needless to say, this form of thought is not an image. আবার বলা প্রয়োজন যে এই form of thought একটা কোনো image নয়. It is not a mental representation. It is a universal form or category. Pure thought, pure form, and category or notion have the same meaning or significance for Hegel. As we proceed, we shall see that to Hegel the universal as a medium of philosophical thinking is self-active, and therefore he calls this universal active universal. So many things comes in the way of understanding pure thought. Pure thought is a pure form. Then pure thought, pure form is a universal. That universal is a concrete universal. That universal is an active universal. You cannot avoid one to detain another. All this must be taken up in order that we may follow the march of thought. The march of thought. Hegel wishes to emphasize that that which is the vehicle of philosophical thinking cannot be anything particular, which is contingent. If anything is particular, it must be contingent and variable. Logic and all branches of philosophy cannot but be anything less than the science of such universal forms. Now, the next question is, the question that naturally arises in respect of the above characteristic of pure thought, does it have any content as being pure, or is it devoid of any content? Hegel claims that no form of thought is devoid of content, but its content is not derived from anything outside of itself. The rigid, unsurpassable conscious distinction between form and content has no place in Hegel. On the contrary, absolute idealism Hegel is based on a refutation of the Kantian distinction. That is a very traditional distinction Kant made between, in order to have knowledge, we must have both the form of knowledge and the content of knowledge. But Hegel denies this distinction. He believes we have no right to make this distinction because it is the same thought as a form of thought produces its own content. The content is there within thought itself. You cannot separate the form and content within thought. And therefore, our knowledge is knowledge of a different type. It is knowledge, it is self-knowledge of a thought knowing itself, moving itself, knowing itself, as it may advance from one stage to another. Thought or reason in the Hegelian philosophical system is a creative force that can create a world of its own. So Hegel says that thought is at home with itself. There is nothing over or below or beyond thought. It is truly self-dependent. If it were dependent on the external world, it would not have been free. Thought is also free. This is another characteristic of thought. Thought is free. Thought without freedom is no thought at all. It is not constrained by anything outside itself. If it were dependent on an external world, it would not have been free. Thought without freedom is no thought at all. Conscious conception of mind receiving subjective representations from external objects makes it a form of subjective idealism, recognizably different from Hegel's absolute idealism. So Hegel's absolute idealism is to be differentiated from Kantian idealism. That Kantian idealism has been described by Hegel. It is Hegel's description that his idealism, Kantian idealism, is subjective idealism. Where does the objectivity of Hegelian idealism lie? That is the point. In Hegel, I have given you some reading materials. You will find it over there. How does he establish his objective idealism? I request you to read the article by Collingwood. There it has been very simply described. How does Hegelian idealism differ from other forms of idealism? In Hegel's system, a Hegel system has three parts. One is the philosophy of idea, one is the philosophy of nature, the other is philosophy of mind. In Hegel's philosophy, in the march of thought, beginning with idea, down to the development of mind, we pass from one stage, from the stage of idea to the stage of nature, the idea of nature or idea of philosophy of nature, then to the idea of mind. So according to Hegel's philosophic vision, mind comes only after the development of nature. So nature is not dependent on mind. It is a phase of development of spirit itself. That's why, like Berkeleyan subjectivism, subjective idealism, nature is not dependent on mind, because mind was not there at that time. Mind develops only afterwards. That's why in his system, he can claim that I have developed a system of objective idealism. Now, objectivity lies there also, that all these thought forms are universals. If thought forms are universals, they cannot but be objective. The mark of subjectivity is that it is attached to some one mind or another. But what is objective for all. It is the manifestation of one single thought or reason. So, this is how Hegel's position differs from that of Kant. If nature and mind comes logically or ideally after thought, the objectivity of thought is ensured and the danger of subjective idealism is thus averted. However, here one thing should be clearly kept in mind: the self-generation or self-reproductive character of thought is the basis of Hegel's claim, and we need to give special attention to Hegel's argument in this respect. Now, as we move towards a deeper understanding of Hegel, we find that he works and makes advance with an unparalleled philosophical vision. In the process of making such advance, he passes through the great domain of past philosophy, tries to overcome many of their shortcomings, and at the same time tries to incorporate what is acceptable and beneficial for the progress of philosophy. He even offers solutions to problems that appear to be irresolvable. One such problem is the problem of the abstract and concrete universal. I have told you that according to Hegel, thought is universal, it is concrete universal. Now I am telling you that it is to be distinguished from what is called an abstract of universal. Now, Locke understands abstract universal as exclusive of all particulars, as it involves a process of abstraction of all the qualities of a group of particulars. Hegel, on the contrary, believes that thought is essentially concrete. A concept might appear to be abstract, but when we attend to it deeply, we find that it moves towards the concrete through a process of mediation. It appears before Hegel's vision that no concept can stand in isolation, but on the contrary, each moves towards a complete unity, a complete universal. In fact, as we go through his logic, as we go through his lectures on history of philosophy, as we go through his doctrine of the state, in his philosophy of right, everywhere we find how does thought moves from one abstract standpoint to another abstract standpoint, and how does it overcome both the abstractions in a higher concrete unity. That concrete unity justifies Hegel's view that everywhere thought evolves through a concrete universal. That is his main point. Here again we shall have to know how the process works, what is the medium of thought for moving from the abstract to the concrete. Hegel understands thought not only as a universal, but also as an active universal. What I am trying to place before you some of the characteristics of thought, Hegelian thought. I hope you have followed me. Some of the characteristics of thought as understood by Hegel. He has described it as universal, he has described it as concrete, but now he says that it is an active universal. That is a characteristic emphasized with due importance by Jane Finlay. That this active nature of the universal, or activity of the universal form of thought, constitutes the hallmark of Hegelian conception of philosophy as a form of thinking. Hegel views mind not as a substance, as a passive receptor of impressions. It is not a theatrical stage where impressions appear and glide away as Hume imagines it to be. On the contrary, it is a subject involved in constant activity. Mind is not anything else than self-thinking thought or totality of thought forms. If we do not have any misgiving about what Hegel makes out here, it is easy for us to understand that each thought form must be characterized as active. Hegel's philosophical vision encourages him to reach the conclusion that an active mind, a universal mind, is active everywhere. In the introduction to his encyclopedia, Hegel remarks, for these thousands of years, the same architect has directed the work, and that architect is the one living mind whose nature is to think, to bring to self-consciousness what it is, and that with its being thus set as object before it, to be at the same time raised above it, and so to reach a higher stage of its being. This is the very illuminating sentence given by him in the very introduction to his encyclopedia. That is one architect, the same architect. That is active mind, that is reason, and that is, the universal. It is in this context that Hegel compares and contrasts history of philosophy and philosophy of history. His firm opinion is that the same active thought is displayed in both with a slight difference. Philosophy of history gives us a panoramic view of the inward development of thought at different stages. Here I like to point out one thing, that Hegel has given so many lectures that I have told you earlier. He has devoted a series of lectures on philosophy of history. Philosophy of history. He studied history as a subject as it were. He studied history as a subject as it were. While even in his philosophy of right, he says that mankind has passed through four stages of history. One he calls the Oriental stage, the second he calls the Greek stage, The third he calls the Roman state. The fourth he calls the Germanic state. Naturally, the Germanic state is conceived by Hegel as the most, as the latest of the evolution of history. However, that is his view. It is not shared by everyone. However, this is how he understands, he tries to understand the specific feature. Each of these historical periods, while understanding the specific features, he was referring to the thought forms that are being developed, that are being activated through these phases of history. So his study of the philosophy of history is something different from all other historical studies by him. What do I mean by all other historical studies? He devoted lectures to the history of aesthetics, the philosophy of aesthetics. He devoted lectures to the history of philosophy. While devoting his lecture on history of philosophy, he in fact tried to understand all forms of philosophy throughout the world, from Indian, Chinese, Japanese, down to the philosophies in all in Europe, the main trends in Europe, and then also in his own country. Now, philosophy of history gives us what? Philosophy of history gives us a panoramic view of the inward development of thought at different stages. But when the development of thought is presented from a historical and external point of view, we have what is called the history of philosophy. This is how he differentiates his account of philosophy of history and history of philosophy. We should remember that Hegel is the first historian of philosophy. Some of you are not students of philosophy. Those who are students of philosophy, they have to study, they have to wrestle hard with different philosophers in their history of philosophy book syllabus. History of philosophy syllabus. Now, in history of philosophy syllabus, we have to follow chronologically the views of different philosophers. And nobody before Hegel thought about history of philosophy as a subject of study, a subject for analysis, separate analysis and comparison. Now, this is being done by Hegel for the first time. It is well known that he surveyed European philosophy from its Ionian beginning. Ionia was an island of Greece, from where the Greek philosophy developed, down to his immediate predecessor, Shelley. He covered the entire range of philosophical contribution by the masterminds from the beginning of history, as it were, from the beginning of history of philosophy. He also surveyed Chinese and Indian philosophy on the basis of evidence, although in a debate, that were available to him at the time. The principle that Hegel reiterated while dealing with different systems of philosophy is that each philosophy centers around a single principle. But then if there has to be one universal philosophy, it must take the form of one comprehensive system, again centering around one single principle. That is, every philosophy centers around one single principle. It is the task of the student or the scholar studying history of philosophy to discover that central principle of one philosophy. The one all-comprehensive philosophy system must involve and include all the philosophical systems preceding it. That is, here also Hegel has in mind the work of system building. He was after system building. While discussing all the philosophies, He was trying to give us a picture of a philosophy which will be developed as a system incorporating all the other philosophies. In other words, it will be a system that includes all the other systems. It will be a system, it will be the most pervasive, all-inclusive system that will include all the other philosophical systems. Now, while discussing this problem, how to deal with a particular philosophy or a particular philosophical system and its relation to other philosophical systems, he has given us a particular concept, the concept of totality. The concept of totality, which has been made use of by so many Marxologists in the last century, was in fact a contribution by Hegel. Hegel finds the real meaning of a system in its being a totality. An all-inclusive philosophy must be a totality of totalities. However, each philosophy, each totality, begins from what is the simplest and becomes more and more concrete as it develops. This Hegelian conception of totality has been used by some of the Marxologists in their analysis of Marxism. It is, all the Marxologists know it. Sometimes Hegel likens not only this, the totality involving all the totalities, he has some other conception also. Sometimes Hegel likens the relation between one universal philosophy, the philosophy as he calls it, and other philosophies as a relationship between a universal and its differentiations or particulars. The entire domain of philosophy is thus woven out of the organic partnership between the universal and the particular. So Hegel has before him the vision of the entire systems of philosophy prevailing in his time throughout the world. That ensured his place as an encyclopedic mind in the world. Now you see, the entire domain of philosophy is thus, almost on an analogous consideration, Hegel likens the relationship between one universal philosophy and particular philosophies as one between a circle of circles and particular circles that come under this circle. This is the opinion that he espoused in his encyclopedia. Each philosophy, as being a particular, has its own limit. In a way, it is the limitation of the principle around which it revolves. According to its inner dialectic, the circle in question of the particular philosophy passes over to some other philosophy, which again, as it centers around a principle, becomes a circle. As thought moves, one form of philosophy moves over to another form of philosophy, sometimes by way of criticism, but no later philosophy can cancel or negate the earlier philosophy. Every later philosophy must include the earlier ones within it. That is his dialectical argument everywhere. The dialectic does not simply negate, but sublates and includes what is negated. Now, according to its inner dialectic, the earlier circle in question or the particular philosophy passes over to some other philosophy, which again, as it centers around a principle, becomes a circle. The process as a whole ensures a rightful place of the universal philosophy as the circle of circles. So two conceptions I have given you. This is how Hegel explains his position of one universal philosophy to be distinguished from other particular philosophies. Sometimes he describes this as a totality of totalities, sometimes he describes it as a circle of circles. Self-reproductive and self-generative pure thought, Hegel characterizes as speculative. This is another characteristic of pure thought. Pure thought is speculative. What does it mean by it? This use makes Hegel the author of speculative philosophy. His philosophy is called speculative philosophy. The word speculation is often used in a pejorative sense, but Hegel confers a special philosophical sense or meaning upon it. What is that? Speculation in its ordinary or pejorative sense means conjectures, guesswork of what lies elsewhere or in the future. Thus we speculate about weather, about political development, about stock index, or a host of social events and changes. But for Hegel, speculation is a moment of philosophical thought that continuously creates and recreates itself from within itself. That makes his philosophy speculative. That is, thought makes itself out of itself, but it makes itself out of itself. How? That is, it starts with a humble beginning, with a bare, indeterminate something, then it reaches the point of absolute knowledge. This is how the whole system works. I have not the time to explain to you his system. It is not my purpose was not to deliver a lecture on Hegel's system here. That's why I am trying to explain to you some of the basic concepts, without which our understanding of Hegel will remain incomplete, I think. If you do not know what is the meaning of concretive reversal, if you do not know what is active reversal, if you do not know what is a notion, if you do not know what is a self-reproductive thought, what is speculative thought, what is speculative philosophy, how can you understand Hegel's philosophy? So, I have chosen this topic for our discussion here. Also, for Hegel, pure thought is spiritual. It is spiritual thought. With ordinary people, or with people deeply committed to religion, to be religious is to be spiritual, and vice versa. But Hegel provides a new definition of spirituality. To be spiritual is to move forward along the path of self-knowledge. The more a man is endowed with self-awareness, the more spiritual he becomes. On Hegel's understanding, the more a man traverses along the track of thought, the more spiritual does he become. The essence of spirituality lies in into-reflection. As thought gazes its attention upon itself, it attains self-awareness of knowledge. There is obviously a difference between mere thought and knowledge. Mere thought and knowledge, there is difference. All knowledge is thought, but all thought is not knowledge. All knowledge is thought, but all thought is not knowledge. Thought moves along the lowest to the highest path of knowledge. As per our tradition, the Indian tradition, the highest stage of knowledge is the stage of supraconsciousness. But this is, according to Hegel, is religious consciousness. From the perspective of Hegel's philosophy, highest stage of spirituality lies in the highest form of self-thinking thought, or the absolute or spirit or reason. That is absolute knowledge. Here we have the philosophical counterpart of the religious sense of spirituality. Here we have the philosophical counterpart of the religious sense of spirituality. This spirituality is essentially contemplation, and Aristotle called it, as I have already told you, noesios, noesis, noesios, or thought of thought. Summarizing what we have said so far, we may find the following conceptual distinctions, which are the sources of many philosophical discussions and disputes. What are the conceptual distinctions? In philosophy, we make distinction between act and object, between particular and universal, between abstract and concrete, between immediate and mediate. if we can, if we have understood Hegel's conception of pure thought, we can be clear about this distinction as well. These distinctions are vital for our discussion of idealism, for our discussion of realism, and even in our general discussion of epistemology. From the Hegelian point of view, these distinctions can be explained from the standpoint of thought as speculative, self-generative, or self-reproductive. The realist epistemology looks upon the terms of these distinctions as qualitatively different. Thus, whatever is an act belongs to the mind, whatever is an object lies outside the mind, outside the mind. Similarly, the particular is spatiotemporal, and the universal, if conceived as abstraction from particulars, cannot but be mental. The immediate is what is given to one sense or another. The mediating intervenes in between two immediates as distinct entities on their own. But Hegelian analysis of pure thought explains such distinctions as internal to thought itself. We might have a passage from one term of the distinction to another, but all such distinctions are internal to thought. Nothing falls outside of thought, and that thought remains settled within itself. Now, this explains broadly Hegel's conception of pure thought, Hegel's characterizations of pure thought, but a few words must be said about the movement of pure thought. That movement of thought, Hegel surely, unambiguously calls dialectical. There is no doubt about it. But I tell you, I cannot fulfill your expectations. My time is almost over because you see, dialectic involves so many things, so many discussions are necessary. However, we can broadly understand it if we follow it in a simpler manner. The most distinguishing feature of pure thought is that in its dialectical nature. Pure thought makes dialectical advance by way of finding within itself its own opposite or otherness. How? There are so many examples in Hegelian philosophy, in Hegel's works, where dialectic operates how. Something is said as something definite or determinate, and if something is determinate, it must have been made determinate by something other than itself. So that other is its other. So that other also is something different or which negates it. So the determinate and the negation of it are as it were locked together. But this situation can be overcome only in a higher movement of thought, and that is inclusive of both the first thought and the second thought. And this is called the concrete thought, or the concrete universal, or the notion, or the category, as you understand it. So this is how dialectic is very much involved in the movement of thought from one place to another. In Hegel's logic, we find the conception of a limit. We find the conception of a being explained to exemplify the working of dialectic. For example, being is something he calls indeterminate. Being is indeterminate. Why? Being cannot be described in any terms. We cannot describe it in terms of quantity, that is 1 or 2 or 3. We cannot describe it in quantitative terms. We cannot qualify it, that it is big or small. We cannot say anything. We cannot spatially determine it, that it is here, not there. There is something outside it, and there is something below it, something above it. Then it is truly indeterminate. But if something is truly indeterminate, then it is as good as nothing. So it is as it were a vacuum. It is nothing. So the idea of being leads us to the idea of nothing. Thereby, I am giving a very short explanation. I have no time in that. So, the two terms are as it were weight-locked. Being and nothing are as it were weight-locked. There is as it were a movement to and fro, from being to nothing, from nothing to being. And this movement from being to nothing and nothing to being, Hegel calls becoming, which is a concrete idea, which is a category, which is notion. This is how Hegel explains it. And that is the essence of dialectic. Dialectic is involved within thought itself. Within thought itself. And sometimes he refers to certain changes in society, and in social formations, in societal structures, where that dialectic also operates. We can find so many instances in his philosophy of right also. However, this is how we find that the medium through which thought develops, as I was referring to, is the medium of dialectic. Medium of dialectic. The dialectic of advance of thought is often represented in the triadic form of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. But Hegel warns us against the triadic representation of dialectic, for in his opinion, the self-reproductive nature of pure thought cannot be fully captured by any numerical representation, such as the triad, as involved in three and three terms alone, as the unity of three terms alone. We cannot say that. Often the movement might involve more than three terms. And that's why although he adopts the triadic form here and there, he does not want to describe dialectic simply in terms of the triad or the unity of three terms. A comprehensive understanding of Hegel's dialectic requires us to be clear about two things. First, we should understand the difference between dialectic and understanding, or what Hegel calls Verstand on the one hand, and dialectic and reason, or what Hegel calls Vernunft on the other. Secondly, apart from these extraneous comparisons, we should also have a clear understanding about what does Hegel mean by contradiction. Hegel has made the significant distinction between formal contradiction and real contradiction, which comes very close to the idea of opposition rather than that of contradiction. A clear grasp of this distinction will enable us to know how far Hegel was successful in establishing a dialectical logic as distinguished from the formal logic of Aristotle. I am sorry, I cannot enter into the detailed discussion of Hegel's dialectic, because it is a topic that will call for discussion for several hours. I have touched upon certain aspects of thought only, and not more than that. And I don't have enough time to explain it to you in details. I'm sorry for that. Thank you for your patience here.